Regardless of gauge, the modeling of narrow gauge railways is a very popular subject in the model railroading fraternity. There are even regularly scheduled meetings for those interested. Without the prototype, there'd be no modeling. That's an important point to remember. In part one, we looked at the origins of narrow gauge in North Wales. Part two covered the 2-foot phenomena in the New England states. And just for a moment, I wish I had a good selection of narrow gauge images from the 1870s to the 1940s, but I don't. So given that the Denver and Rio Grande Western basically kept its 1880 designs to the end, so allows me to substitute later Denver and Rio Grande images to provide you with the flavor of this entire era. And the history of narrow gauge railways, part 3. Denver and Rio Grande Western Northern lines. Tonight's segment, the first of 3 parts, well, actually 2.5 if you want to get technical. We'll look at one railroad's lines in the state of Colorado, the railroad which became synonymous with the term narrow gauge. And how do I mean synonymous? When I joined the NMRA in 1966, every issue of the bulletin had an article on Denver and Rio Grande Western work cars. You know, the O series. But we'll talk about that a little bit a few months from now. But first, let's put the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway into its historical context. The Colorado and Clear Creek Railroad was incorporated during 1865 to link Golden with Central City, Idaho Springs, Denver, and Boulder. In 1866, the corporation changed its name to the Colorado Central Pacific Railroad and then allied itself with the Union Pacific. The line again changed its name to the Colorado Central Railroad on January 4th, 1868, but it's still not taken any actions that could be construed as constructions. Construction of the Colorado Central finally did begin, and the first portion of the line in standard gauge was opened between a location known as Jersey Junction, 2 miles north of Denver on the Denver Pacific, and the town of Golden on September 24th, 1870. Work on the Colorado Central continued west from Golden during September 1871. The portion of the line west of Golden was built to the 3-foot gauge in order to save construction costs. The next 12 miles to Big Hill was opened with the Sunday excursion train service on September 1st, 1872. The jewel of the Clear Creek District, which is what we've been talking about, was the Devil's Gate High Bridge, which was scrapped circa 1840. And yes, it's been reinstated and rebuilt. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railway Company was organized on September 30th, 1872 in the territory of Colorado to build a 3-foot narrow gauge railroad into the South Park area of Colorado. Gunnison celebrated the arrival of the South Park line from Denver on September 5th, 1882. Leadville will be open for public travel via Denver, South Park, and Pacific-owned line from a junction at Como on September 30th, 1884. Here's a meet at Buffalo in Denver, South Park, and Pacific days with 2 Mason Fairley designed locomotives. Colorado and Southern Railway acquired the properties of the Union Pacific, Denver, and Gulf Railway, the former Colorado Central Railroad, and the Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison Railroad, the former Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railway, as of January 11th, 1889. For 6 weeks in 2006, the Colorado and Southern B3C 260 number 9, which led that last train from Leadville, returned to service at the Georgetown Loop Railroad. They spent like $750,000 to restore it, and in doing some work after the season, they magnafluxed the frame and found out there were so many micro fissures it should never run again. Now let's get to our subject. General William J. Palmer incorporated the Denver and Rio Grande Railway on October 27, 1870, with the goal of building a narrow gauge railroad from Denver, Colorado to El Paso, Texas, with branches to Salt Lake City, Utah, the San Juan Mountains Mining District in Colorado, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. The line would also be extended into the country of Mexico and eventually, as the plans were, reach Mexico City. General William J. Palmer rejected the idea of a 2-foot gauge line as being too narrow to construct adequately sized rolling stock. He widened his proposed line to 3 feet. On the Denver and Rio Grande, regular service from Denver to Colorado Springs began on January 1st, 1872. During June 1872, the line reached South Pueblo. Meanwhile, in the rest of the nation, the general public became aware of narrow gauge railways at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And yes, that's the Philadelphia Museum of Art you're looking at. The locomotive in the picture would eventually end up on the Denver and Rio Grande. The passenger cars would end up on the New York and Manhattan Beach Railway located in Brooklyn. The narrow gauge trackage would be salvaged and be used by the New York and Manhattan Beach. And here's a map of the line of the Centennial Exposition narrow gauge in Fairmount Park. And basically, here's the art gallery. This is where we saw the train in the last picture that would head out, go around the loop here. And this is the engine house here. Continue around the loop. Another big loop over a bridge by the Agricultural Hall, and then come on back to the main station by the art gallery. It only lasted during the length of the fair, and as I said, it was dismantled shortly thereafter. Over here, we have a motion of an electric railroad. That's interesting because while it was electrically powered, it was also a monorail. One of the earlier monorails in the United States. Soon, pockets of narrow gauge railway systems began to grow in the United States. What I call the Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Rochester Triangle, the Conotton Valley coal fields in southern Ohio and reaching to Cincinnati, Kings County of New York. There were also isolated lines such as the Boston, Revere Beach, and Lynn Railway, and the East Broad Top Railroad and Coal Company. So much narrow gauge track was built it almost seemed like a 3-foot gauge transcontinental line would be created by connecting the lines of several companies. But it didn't happen. They ran out of money. The narrow gauge began to fade almost as quickly as it had come onto the scene. Let's look at some of the reasons why. One of the original selling points was that narrow gauge equipment was the same size as standard gauge equipment. That is 40-foot long passenger cars and freight equipment in the 25 to 30-foot length. That was true in the 1870s, but things began to grow shortly thereafter on the standard gauge. But standard gauge rolling stock began to grow in length. Passenger equipment went first to 65 feet and then eventually to 85 feet with steel components. Freight equipment grew to an almost standard 40 feet in length and beyond that to 50. It was cheaper to build narrow gauge railways because of the narrow right of way, the sharper curves it could negotiate, and the steeper grades it could climb. But those steep grades, tight curves, and undulating right of way resulted in low operating speeds for the narrow gauge lines. 15 miles an hour was considered a typical good speed. And just to put it in relativity, a horse and wagon would do about 11 miles a day. So much better than a horse and wagon, but not up to the mainline speeds. And where there was a break of gauge interchange, the high cost of manually moving goods from one car to another, not to mention the time to do the transfer, worked against the economics of the narrow gauge. Surprisingly, it was those isolated narrow gauge lines that lasted the longest, such as a commuter line in the Boston area, a mine-to-coal cleaning plant in Pennsylvania, or serving isolated mountain communities in Colorado. Basically, these were self-contained systems that made some form of economic sense. Let me recommend the book American Narrow Gauge Railroads by George W. Hilton, which was published by the Stanford University Press in 1990. You can usually find it on ABE Books or any other good used book website. Enough talk. Let's skip to the 1939 to 1960 period and look at some trains. Denver and Rio Grande Western narrow gauge through the cameras of Richard Kindig and Richard B. Jackson, the northern lines. Starting in the very late 1930s and continuing until the last common carrier train ran, the Denver and Rio Grande Western's 3-foot narrow gauge lines were pursued by rail enthusiast photographers. Using the work of two of them, let's tour the system as it was. And we can talk about the narrow gauge circle another time, but what basically it was, it's starting here in, starting here in Salida, going south all the way to Antonito, then west to Durango, and then up the Rio Grande Southern to Ridgeway, where it connects with the Ouray branch, which brings you to Montrose, and then from Montrose back over to Salida. That was the narrow gauge circle. The northeast corner of the narrow gauge circle was Salida, Colorado. Let's visit there with 4 images from the internet. Salida had one of the more modern stations on the narrow gauge. The Royal Gorge behind Denver and Rio Grande Western, 4771 at Salida in a more modern era. A view of the narrow gauge roundhouse at Salida, second 404 on the turntable. There was also a standard gauge roundhouse here and extensive shops. And Denver and Rio Grande Western 480 and Caboose 0589 in Salida, Colorado in June 1956. Salida was also where the famous roller dump to transfer limestone from or coal from narrow gauge cars to standard gauge cars. Today, if you went there, there's nothing. The Salida narrow gauge roundhouse was responsible for locomotives for the Salida Gunnison Main Line, the Monarch branch, and had a partial responsibility for locomotives on the Valley Line connection to the southern narrow gauge section. Let's look at the Monarch branch first. A 5-mile-long portion of the Gunnison extension from Salida to Poncha Junction opened on November 22nd, 1880. The 6.9 miles of the then Maysville branch opened on March 27th, 1881. On October 18th, 1883, the Maysville branch was extended 9.4 miles to Monarch via a double switchback and a 4.5% grade. Here's a map of the Monarch branch. It's Salida. This is actually a trackage it shares with the main line, and then up to Monarch. And they've sort of glossed over the switchbacks on this map. During 1956, the Monarch branch was converted to standard gauge. What they basically did was just push the track out to standard gauge. Trackage on the connecting main line from Poncha Junction to Salida was also converted to standard gauge. The Dolomite mine shut down during 1982, ending service on the line. The branch was abandoned during 1984. Richard Kindig photographed the Monarch turn going downgrade on May 21st, 1952. 480 leading the Monarch turn, tender first through Maysville. Number 480 on the head end at Maysville. 482 pushing the Monarch turn at Maysville. By the way, don't forget to take in the scenery behind the trains. It's just as fantastic as the trains. 480 leading the Monarch turn, arriving at Garfield. You can see by the steam in the back, there was also a locomotive at both ends. The 482 is a pusher arriving at Garfield. Richard Kindig photographed the Monarch turn negotiating the Garfield switchback on September 19th, 1952. For the record, I was 3 months old on that day. 485 arriving at the Garfield switchback. While the 485 backs the first section of the train up the switchback, if you follow my cursor, that's the first section. The 480 pushes the second part of the train past the siding, past the switch. 485 on the upper tail of the switchback. The 485 ascends the upper level. The 480 ascends the switchback. 485 here with its train. The 480 here with the rest of the train. The second part of the train reaching the upper level. The Monarch turn arrives back at the Garfield switchback. This is on the top. Backing down the middle level at Garfield. As the head end backs down, the rear of the train arrives at the switch. On July 20th, 1954, Richard B. Jackson caught the 480 on a Monarch turn. The 480 arriving at Monarch with caboose 0574. Notice the white dolomite dust has just covered everything here. Closer view of the 480 arriving at Monarch. Remember, these are 70, almost 75-year-old slides. Lenses weren't they what they were, lenses then weren't or what they are now, and there's been some fading of the original images. Arriving at Monarch with caboose 0574. The 480 backing onto the Monarch Y. 480 coming off the Monarch Y. Looks like they're doing some work with culverts in the area. And we're still coming off the Monarch Y. Work car in the background. 480 heading towards the mine. 480 pulling loads from the storage tracks. A little bit of a sequence. Damn those wires. And pulling loads out of the storage yard. And you can see the Y track there in the background. And more cars from the storage yard. And here's a close-up of the 480. And the rear three-quarter view. Well, you know, all rail fans typically take this picture, and then when they get it home, they wonder, well, why did I do that? Caboose 574 departing Monarch. And Monarch as the train departs. From the rear of the train, 1 mile below Monarch. 480 waiting at the upper switch at Garfield. 480 beginning to move at the upper switchback in Garfield. I always find this picture interesting. This is a freight, a mine run freight of all things. And look how well dressed the conductor is. It's a cowboy type hat. It's not a conductor's traditional hat, but the rest of it certainly looks like a conductor's uniform, at least to me. That's a more traditional outfit for a freight brakeman or conductor. Here's throwing a switch on the upper Garfield switchback. And 480 on the tail track of the upper switchback. The 480 seen from the train backing down between switchbacks at Garfield. I believe our photographer, or I hope our photographer, is on the front platform of the caboose. 480 downgrade near Maysville. And there's the back of the caboose 574 downgrade. Rear view of the train 2 miles below Maysville. Ah, yes. The destination of the Monarch branch trains was the Salida barrel loader. The narrow gauge car would be placed on this upper track, which would then turn, and it would send the dolomite down into a standard gauge car at the lower level down here. There was video of it being operated, but I haven't been able to put my hands on it where I could reuse it. The old main line, a 5.0 mile long portion of the Gunnison extension from Salida to Poncha Junction, opened on November 12, 1880. On August 8th, 1881, the 69.1 miles of the Gunnison extension from Poncha Junction to Gunnison via Marshall Pass opened. Here's a map of the old Manion line from Salida to Gunnison. So here we go past the Monarch Branch Junction, Mears Junction, named for Otto Mears, one of the pioneers of railroading in the Colorado area. Marshall Pass, Sargent, Doyle, Parlin, and Gunnison. Gunnison to Poncha Junction was abandoned during 1954. Poncha Junction to Salida was standard gauge for the Monarch Branch during 1956. A view of Mears Junction on August 19th, 1955 by Richard B. Jackson. Two shots of a freight climbing Marshall Pass from the Friends of the Cumberland Toltec. Here's from the caboose. And another view from the caboose as it's arriving at Marshall Pass itself. On August 5th, 1955, Richard B. Jackson visited the out-of-service snow shed on Marshall Pass. In the center of the shed, showing the two tracks there. Spooky. But if it could talk. The turntable inside of the Marshall Pass snow shed. Yeah, there was a turntable, fully protected from the snow inside the snow shed. That's where the pushers were turned to be sent back downgrade. Another view of the turntable. Looking out the west end of the Marshall Pass snow shed. The west end of the Marshall Pass snow shed. And the east side of the Marshall Pass snow shed. May have not been pretty, but it was very effective. And looking east over the top of the Marshall Pass snow shed. Amazing what you can do when the railroad's out of service. And if you notice over here to the right, a little bit down the valley, are some, based on the paint scheme, some Denver and Rio Grande Western related buildings. Another view on the roof of the Marshall Pass snow shed. This is one heck of a lumber yard, if you ask me. There's some of the Marshall Pass buildings looking over the top of the shed, looking east. Marshall Pass looking east, the other side of the snow shed. On August 15th, 1955, Richard B. Jackson traveled west of Marshall Pass. It's the scrap train. Rio Grande Motors 7 on Marshall Pass scrap train. The coal dock at Sargent's, the west end of Marshall Pass. Sargent's, Colorado from the coal dock. The Gunnison Montrose passenger train was discontinued on July 5th, 1935. The Denver and Rio Grande Western modernized 22 of its narrow gauge passenger cars in 1936 and 1937. A modernized train, the Shivano, was placed in service between Salida and Gunnison on April 9th, 1937. Richard B. Jackson caught a few images to this train on July 7th, 1940. And the 479 with the Shivano near Mears Junction. And the Shivano with the 479 at the Gunnison Depot. The typical consist of these engines was these trains was behind the engine was a baggage car, a baggage RPO, a coach, and then a parlor observation car that had a facility for serving meals in it. The Shivano was discontinued on November 2nd, 1940. The Gunnison Roundhouse on July 7th, 1940. The Gunnison Roundhouse was responsible for a fleet of 280s that was used on the Black Canyon line, the Crested Butte branch, and the Baldwin branch. The two 460s for the Lake City branch were also once found here. It also turned around 282s used on the old main line to Salida. Inside the Gunnison Roundhouse, I had to work terribly with this slide. It was like black. Black Canyon Line, originally known as the Utah Extension, 134.9 miles of track between Gunnison and Grand Junction via Montrose. Track laying was completed as of November 21st, 1882. The Black Canyon Line, originally the Utah Extension, between Gunnison and Grand Junction. Coracante, where the famous needle is, we'll see that in a few moments. Grand Junction to Montrose was standard gauge during 1906, reducing Gunnison to Montrose to branch line status. Sappanarrow to Cedar Creek was abandoned during 1948, breaking the narrow gauge circle. And this was done by the Denver and Rio Grande as the first means of getting rid of their narrow gauge system. Cedar Creek to Ouray Junction, abandoned during 1952. Sappanarrow to Gunnison was abandoned during 1954. We join Richard Kindig as he rides the caboose of Extra 361 west from Gunnison to Montrose on June 6, 1940. Extra 361 west from the caboose 2 miles west from Gunnison. This is probably one of the better sequences in this slideshow. Extra 367 west from the caboose 5 miles west of Gunnison. Extra 361 west from the caboose 7 miles west of Gunnison. Look at the number of tank cars in the consist. Folks, if you'll excuse me for one moment. Okay, folks, I'm back. You don't want to know what my wife's got going on in the other room. Here's Extra 361 west from the caboose 9 miles west of Gunnison. And here we are passing the stock pens at Iola. Now, when stock was being transported on any railroad, including the narrow gauge, it had to be unloaded and watered, exercised, and watered every 8 hours. So that explains why there were stock pens all over the place on the Denver and Rio Grande, Union Pacific, and just about all the railroads out west. Here's 361 west from the caboose near Cibola. And getting into some rocky territory. And 3 miles west of Cibola. Notice we've got some stock cars in the consist. 4 miles west of Cibola. And in the cannon, 6 miles west of Cibola. 2 miles west of Sappanarrow. 2 miles west of Lake City Junction. Coracante siding and section house viewed from alongside of Extra 361 west. This was originally on the Denver and Rio Grande's logo, and it was there for many years. It still exists, but this whole area has been flooded by a reservoir, and it is no longer visible above the surface of the reservoir. And I blew up the slide. It's fuzzy, but here's the Coracante section house from the previous image, and you can see one of the track maintainers, track speeders are sitting there. 2 miles west of Coracante. Sorry if I'm being repetitive. C-21 class number 361 poses at Cimarron on June 6th, 1940. Or should I say 6th of June? Although it's the wrong year. This locomotive was originally owned by the Crystal River Railroad, and it was one of the heaviest 280s on the Denver and Rio Grande. Approaching Crystal Creek. Notice the tank cars are no longer in the consist. That's the building you see there at the right, based on its design, is a track foreman's residence. They were, in other words, each section had a section man, and every couple of sections there was a track foreman and the track foreman had a house for himself and his family. The other building you see here is probably a train order office and would be considered part of the station. Here's 2 miles west of Crystal Creek. And here's the 318 in Montrose by Richard Kindig on June 30th, 1949. The Ouray branch. This 35.8-mile branch line was opened on December 21st, 1887. The Rio Grande Southern opened a connection at Ridgeway during November 1890. The Ouray branch between Montrose and Ouray. The Rio Grande Southern connected at Ridgeway. And the Rio Grande Southern, if you were going to ask, it's a whole nother show. The bankruptcy court ordered the Rio Grande Southern shut down as of December 17th, 1951. Ridgeway to Ouray was abandoned on March 21st, 1953. Ridgeway to Montrose was standard gauged on April 1st, 1953. The last standard gauge freight train ran on November 29th, 1976. But before that happened, the National Railway Historical Society actually ran a fan trip using Pullman sleeping cars down this branch line. Richard Kindig chased the Ouray turn with the 318 out of Montrose on June 8th, 1951. 8 miles north of Ridgeway. And same place, just turning left. And here's the third view from the scene. Quite a lot of freight they were still moving in 1951. Here's Ridgeway passing the interchange with the Rio Grande Southern. This is the passenger station. This building has been turned 90 degrees and moved about 50 to 100 feet to the left, but it still stands. Here's Extra 318 standing in Ouray. And there were Otto Mears actually had plans to build a railroad through that cliff you see in the background to connect with one of his 3 little narrow gauge lines out of Silverton. The line would have been totally in tunnel, an electric cable operated line. Never happened, but it's always wonderful to contemplate if it had. Here's Extra 318 standing in Ouray. And here's Ouray Station in the 1940s. The building is long gone. There's now a trailer camping ground at this location. Crested Butte branch. Trackage from Gunnison to just north of Crested Butte, 29.4 miles, open for passenger traffic on November 4th, 1881. On December 19th, 1882, the Crested Butte branch was extended 2.7 miles to Anthracite. Guess what they found at Anthracite? The Baldwin and Crested Butte branches. The Baldwin branch was originally part of the Colorado and Southern, and the Denver and Rio Grande Western got it in exchange for trackage rights. The Crested Butte branch served coal mines. It was abandoned during 1954. Here's the 498 switching at Almont on the Crested Butte branch, September 18th, 1941, image by L.S. Logue. And the 278 switching at Castleton, July 4th, 1941. This is a picture by Otto Perry. The Baldwin branch. During 1883, 20.4 miles of trackage was completed by the Denver, South Park, and Pacific between Gunnison and Ohio Creek via Baldwin. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific became the Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison in 1889, and the Colorado Southern in 1899. Leased by the Denver Rio Grande, the Baldwin branch was leased by the Denver Rio Grande Western during 1911 and purchased during 1937. And here's your Baldwin branch. As you would expect, it served coal mines and it was abandoned during 1954. 223 near Baldwin, July 4th, 1941 by Jackson C. Thode. And the 268 with the scrapping train, May 1955, for my old friend John Krause. The 268 was nicknamed the Bumblebee, and it had been painted that way for use in a movie. In a movie, people liked it. They kept that paint scheme. In fact, they liked the paint scheme so much in the Denver and Rio Grande Western, they applied it to the passenger cars on the Silverton branch. And here's the Bumblebee with the scrap train at the old C&S Gunnison Depot on June 19th, 1955. Again, that's an internet image. Lake City branch, open from Lake Junction near Saponaro to Lake City, 35.8 miles, open for public service on August 15th, 1888. During September 1933, this line was leased to the San Cristobal Railway for operation. And the endpoints of the Lake City branch still show on this 1940s map of the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Back up when they leased it out they were still worried about having to maintain service. To back up the operation, the Denver Rio Grande Western maintained two T12 narrow gauge 460s. San Cristobal discontinued operations during the summer of 1937. The line was dismantled. One of the T12s would come to New York City for exhibition at the 1939-1940 World's Fair. After being displayed at the 1939-1940 World's Fair, T12-169 returned to Colorado, where it was placed on display. This was on display in Antonito. The 168 sister, the 168, was placed on display in Colorado Springs. And fortunately, one of them has been returned to service. The other one they're still working on it. And we're getting near the end of our presentation here. The Orient branch opened from Mears Junction to Orient, formerly Hot Springs Mine, via Villa Grove. Distance is 27.8 miles on October 28, 1881. The San Luis branch, 54 miles long between Villa Grove and Alamosa, was opened on September 9, 1890. This 54-mile long branch included a 51-mile straight section. And it runs through some of the most boring country in Colorado. And here's the Valley Line. Not very well populated, even to this day. But it linked the northern and southern narrow gauge systems. Trackage between Alamosa and Hooper was made dual gauge during 1930. Hooper's to Mears Junction was abandoned during 1950. The dual gauge track between Hooper and Alamosa was made standard gauge only during 1951. Abandonment to the remaining trackage approved on November 21st, 1958. Here's the 497 passing under the Telltale at Mears Junction. This is a circa 1946 picture by R.W. Richardson. Probably know R.W. Richardson as the first director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. The former Valley Line grade approaching Mears Junction on August 15, 1955 by Richard B. Jackson. That's this trackage right up here. And this is the old main line here. The 492 with a southbound freight approaching Round Hill, November 4th, 1949, R.W. Richardson. The 480 near Villa Grove, November 1950, Ralph W. Richardson. This is probably one of my favorite pictures of the Colorado narrow gauge. It just, I don't know, it just says it all to me. And the 499 near Moscow or Moffett, 1950 by R.W. Andrews. Notice there's a large number of stock cars in the contest. And I want to thank my good friend Joe Bucks, who gave me a big selection of Denver and Rio Grande Western narrow gauge slides because he said, I don't have any interest in this stuff. Thank you for viewing this presentation, and I'm going to finish the presentation and take any of your questions. The legal stuff. In the fourth part of this series, we'll explore the southern narrow gauge lines of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway. Please consider joining us. So, folks, thank you. I hope I haven't bothered you too much. Are there any questions, comments?
Yeah, Ed, I have a comment. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Cassidy.
Hi, Ed. Uh, your most recent comment about that being one of your favorite photos. When I looked at that, it just screamed Rocky Mountain narrow gauge. I think the mountains in the background may have something to do with that. The landscape is just iconic in that photo.
Thank you. That's pretty much what I thought. But I'm
Yeah, you're
glad
not alone in
we agree.
that.
I'm glad we agree.